In a moment of rage and arrogance, a racist cop strikes what he thinks is just another black man, only to realize in the blink of an eye that he's made the biggest mistake of his life. What follows next sends shockwaves through the courtroom, leaving everyone stunned as the true power of justice takes center stage. It was just another ordinary day in the courthouse. The morning sun had barely filtered through the dusty windows, and the familiar hustle of lawyers, clerks, and defendants echoed down the long hallway. The buzz of chatter reverberated through the chambers, each person consumed with their own business. The scent of coffee lingered in the air, a weak attempt at masking the sterile smell of old paper and polished wood. There was a sense of routine in the air, as though this was just another day in the never-ending grind of the judicial system. The tension in the air, though subtle, was palpable. The courtroom had been filled with stories of people's lives in the balance, but today was different. Today, something was about to happen that would shake the foundations of this courthouse. Officer Rick Lawson, a seasoned cop with over 2 decades of service under his belt, strutted through the courthouse halls with a swagger that most would say came with a badge. He had worked his way through the ranks, had seen his fair share of cases, and had managed to climb the ladder, becoming somewhat of a local hero in his precinct. He believed that the badge he wore afforded him respect, authority, and, most importantly, immunity. It wasn't just the title, it was the power that came with it. Lawson had always felt untouchable, believing that his experiences on the streets entitled him to a certain privilege. But that day, the arrogant attitude that had carried him this far would soon prove to be his undoing. He had been called into the courthouse as a witness for a minor case, one that barely stirred any ripples in the public's attention. It wasn't high profile, and it wasn't the kind of case that would change the landscape of law enforcement. In fact, Lawson hadn't paid much attention to it. It was just another routine visit, a few words on the stand, some quick questions, and then he could get back to doing what he did best, patrolling the streets and asserting his dominance in any situation that demanded it. But what he didn't know was that the day would not go as he had planned. As he walked past the security checkpoint and into the courtroom, Lawson couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. The large wooden doors of the courtroom opened, and the room fell silent. All eyes briefly shifted toward him as he made his way to the witness stand. He was used to the attention, whether it was from people on the street or colleagues at work. But there was one thing he didn't expect. The judge, Judge Marcus Caldwell, sat at the head of the room, his calm demeanor almost strikingly different from the atmosphere of the courthouse. His black robe flowed down his shoulders with an air of authority, and his posture was impeccable. Caldwell had been on the bench for over 2 decades, and his reputation preceded him. He was known for his fair and firm rulings, his intelligence, and his ability to remain impartial in the face of even the most challenging cases. His presence was commanding, but it wasn't in the usual way that most people expected. There was no brash display of ego or arrogance. Caldwell simply exuded a quiet confidence that drew respect. What Lawson didn't know was that Caldwell wasn't just another judge. He was a man who had faced adversity throughout his life, a black man who had fought against racism and prejudice at every turn. He had earned his place on the bench through years of dedication, integrity, and hard work. But to Lawson, the fact that the judge was black seemed to be a trivial detail overshadowed by his own biased perception. As Lawson made his way to the witness stand, he couldn't help but mutter a few words under his breath. It was a quiet insult, something that most would have overlooked, but it was enough for Caldwell to hear. The judge's eyes briefly flickered in Lawson's direction, but he didn't react. He had heard it all before. Lawson's mouth twisted into a slight smirk as he prepared to settle into the witness stand. He was used to the routine of these things, but today, something felt off. Perhaps it was the simmering tension in the air, or maybe it was the way Caldwell had looked at him. It didn't matter. Lawson was ready to handle whatever came his way. What he didn't anticipate was the anger brewing just beneath the surface, anger not from Caldwell, but from himself. As the questioning began, Lawson's attention started to wander. He didn't really care about the details of the case. He wasn't there for the facts. He was there to give his testimony, which he planned to get through as quickly as possible. His thoughts drifted back to the little slights he'd experienced in his life, those moments where he'd been wronged, where he'd been forced to swallow his pride. He had never been one to let those things go unnoticed, and as his gaze briefly flickered toward Judge Caldwell, something about the man's calm demeanor stirred something inside him. It irritated him, in fact. As the prosecutor spoke, Lawson began to feel a sense of discomfort. The questions were too probing, too direct. It wasn't just the case that was bothering him, it was the challenge to his authority. It was as though every word out of the prosecutor's mouth was an attack on his character, something that he couldn't tolerate. And then, as though fate itself was playing a cruel joke on him, Judge Caldwell's gaze locked with his. The calmness in the judge's eyes felt like a challenge. It wasn't an aggressive look, nor was it an angry one. It was simply a look of indifference, as though he were unbothered by the insults, by the challenges, by the failures of the system. He had seen it all before, and he had learned to rise above it. To Lawson, however, it felt like an insult. It felt like Caldwell was silently asserting his moral superiority, as if he had somehow defeated Lawson without even trying. In that instant, something snapped. The tension that had been building inside him exploded outward. He had been challenged, no, slighted by the very person who should have been in his corner. This man, this judge who had everything handed to him simply because of the color of his skin, didn't deserve to look at him like that. Lawson's rage was overwhelming, and without thinking, he raised his hand. The slap was swift, a sharp strike across Caldwell's face that echoed through the courtroom. Gasps filled the room, and the air seemed to thicken with shock. The smack of the slap reverberated, as though the sound had shattered something much deeper than just physical space. The entire courtroom stood frozen, no one quite sure what had just happened. The officer stood there, chest heaving, a smug grin on his face, convinced that he had asserted his dominance once and for all. But then, Caldwell's eyes hardened. In a flash, the judge stood, his expression calm but filled with a quiet fury. His voice, when it came, was like ice. "Officer Lawson," he said, each syllable dropping like a hammer, "I believe you've made a grave mistake. What happens next will leave you in disbelief. Follow us on Expect Stories for more shocking tales that reveal the truth about justice, power, and accountability.